So, you want to learn to commute on the Summerboard SBX? Well, I'm not surprised because this board is absolutely sick. Yep, this insane e-skate that emulates snowboarding on dry roads, so that you can turn a boring commute to work into an incredibly fun adventure spinning, drifting and carving all the way through the city, and improve your snowboard riding in the process. We'll explore all the ways that you can ensure a safe ride while commuting with this board, and so much more, so that you too can start snowboarding to work. Learning to ride the Summerboard is incredibly fun, but naturally the edge structure that mimics a snowboard does mean that it can be very dangerous if you start catching the edge at high speed. Now obviously wearing a helmet and wrist guards will help with this, but look, the fact is you are going to be catching an edge at some point when learning to ride this board. It is unavoidable. The more you want to learn in a short period of time, the more you'll fall over. Also, as a quick mention with regards to the speed of this board, it goes around 27 miles per hour. Which, you know, sure, sounds fast, but the truth is that capping out on a Summerboard is not that difficult, because someone confident enough could max it out very quickly. Just hold the trigger and hope for the best. And this is absolutely not what I would recommend you do if you pick up this board, because as one of the best freeboard teachers in the world once told me, if you can master tricks at fairly low speeds, riding the board quickly will come for free. As for riding this board on your daily commute to work, there are quite a lot of things to learn in the process, and so I would highly recommend going into this with the mindset that riding this board on your commute to work is something that you'll work towards, rather than something that you'll jump in and do straight away. But if you're able to learn all of the skills in this video in a sandbox environment, you will be more than ready to take it to the roads. So with those brief preparations in mind, let's jump straight into the first skill that you'll need to commute with this board. First things first is to get your stance right. You're going to want to have your knees fairly bent and your back fairly straight. Bending your knees will help your legs store rotational energy, which is the name of the game when it comes to riding the Summerboard, while keeping your back straight will help center your weight above the center wheels. Given that this board rides slightly back foot heavy, unlike standard snowboarding on the piste, I like to keep my back leg more bent than the front leg. And the reason being is because it then gives you far more control to change your weight using your back foot. This back foot can initiate spins, drifts and all kinds of other tricks, so it's very useful to keep the knee bent so that you can do this. And that's not to mention that when you start going at faster and faster speeds, it allows for a rapid transition between each edge. Here's a nice clip of Stella demonstrating this, and notice how the springiness really helps to initiate spins. Once you've got this stance with most of your weight above the center wheels and a kind of springiness in the fact that your knees are bent, the next step is to try to be as light as possible with your weight onto either your toe or hillside edge. And don't worry if you can't do this first try. I don't think I've ever seen someone who hasn't ridden this board before that hasn't done a stance something like this, with almost all of their weight lying above one of the edges. Because, you know, it's completely terrifying to be on these spinning caster wheels, and at least when you've got your weight over one of the edges, it feels a little bit like a skateboard, kind of. I mean, not really, but just don't worry if you can't do this straight away. That's completely normal. These boards are fairly difficult to pick up, but if you focus on this in particular and keep trying, you will get there very quickly. Learning these aspects of riding the Summerboard and Freeboard was honestly a bit of a game changer for me. Having your back leg especially act as a kind of spring allows you to really push the board out to any extent that you like, and if you couple this with having a very light amount of pressure on the edge that you're drifting on, you can feel in total control of your speed without actually drifting, because although you're not putting much weight to drift on the wheels, you know that you could if you wanted to. And like I said, these can help do spins really fluidly. It's honestly something that you'll always see more advanced riders do, but that you can learn right at the beginning of your journey with this board. An obvious place to practice this would be a car park, where you can try to center wheel for as long as possible and then work on riding on two of the edge wheels while attempting to ride in a straight line. If done correctly and that you have a very light amount of pressure on the edge, you'll almost be able to keep to a straight line. Obviously you will drift to one side. This is a great way to get used to putting a very light amount of pressure on the board, which ideally is how you should ride if you're going much faster. For one, it will make sure that your wheels last much longer, but more importantly, if you've got a very light touch on the edge, it means that most of your weight is on the center wheel. This will drastically reduce the number of times that you catch the edge due to chatter, which is when the caster wheels start to spin because your weight distribution is slightly off. As you can see here, I can force a chatter to happen by putting too much weight on my hillside edge. Now obviously in this case it wasn't a problem because it's expected, but if you get the chatter when you don't expect it, it can cause some pretty bad crashes. And so trying your best to keep as much weight over the center wheel as possible will reduce how often this happens. So you've now developed the perfect stance. Your weight is mostly over the center wheels, you can use the spring of your back leg to control where the board is drifting, and because of the fact that most of your weight is over the center wheels, slight adjustments in your feet can very easily help you to change edges, instead of having to lean over one edge or the other. Next up are the kinds of techniques that you'll need to know in order to ride this board safely around the city. In particular are four main skills: riding on narrow paths, looking both sides while you ride, knowing how to ride on rough ground, and ideally learning to ride in switch. When it comes to riding very narrow paths, having mastered your weight distribution and a light touch on each edge should make riding narrow paths very straightforward. I tend to try and take them on my preferred edge if possible, which is the heel side edge, although if you've practiced riding in a straight line on both edges, this shouldn't matter much. You don't need to necessarily center wheel for a narrow path. As long as you have a light weight on each edge, you can still transition back and forth between your toe and heel side edges. If you are going to be trying to pick up some speed on narrow paths, I would highly recommend knowing how to come to a stop either front side or back side while not turning left or right. Here's an example at low speed. You see I don't turn much left or right, which makes it possible to stop on such a narrow path. Again, this is only possible if you've mastered having a light touch on each edge, because you really need to initiate the turn without heavily putting your weight over the edge that you're drifting on. If you want to practice this in a car park, just try and drift either front side or back side while cutting as little speed as possible. You'll find that if your weight is light enough over the edge, you should be able to do this indefinitely. This is a great exercise which I saw pushed by some of the best freeboard teachers in the world, and especially backside is very difficult to master. And if you do manage to master it, you're going to find out that riding narrow paths on the Summerboard is a lot more like riding them on a bike, due to the unbelievable amount of control that you have when moving the board left or right. It also helps to know how to ride the board on rough ground, which to be honest is more of a psychological barrier than anything else. The trick is to try not to stress out if you feel the ground underneath you become rough and you're losing control of the board. Because 9 times out of 10 this is just a feeling that you have, and if you just stick it out, the board will ride through the ground completely fine. Other than this and having a light touch on your edges, the only thing I can advise is to make sure that your bindings are fairly tight around your feet. I personally have my bindings very tight, although this is definitely a matter of personal preference, but obviously the tighter the bindings are around your feet, the more stable you'll be if the board starts to shift around. The next crucial skill for riding the Summerboard through the city is to be able to separate the motion of the upper half of your body to that of the lower half. You should be able to look both left and right and behind you while riding in a straight line. Obviously, if you're riding on roads, looking left and right before merging onto a different road is incredibly important, and when it comes to looking behind you, I use this to make sure that I'm not holding up any traffic. Now you might think that this is a trivial bit of advice, but you should seriously learn this in a car park before doing it on the road, because especially with the Summerboard, if you start looking behind you, it's very likely that you're going to start shifting your weight around, and kabam, you've just caught an edge. And it's not difficult to practice this. For example, just practice mixing this in while going on a straight line either on the center wheels or on a light touch of the edge wheels. Try looking both sides or behind you while not changing your direction. The fact is, with the Summerboard, you can practice these skills in the safest sandbox of all, the car park, and once you've mastered them, then you should consider taking them to the road. I found when learning to freeboard that riding next to cars was incredibly daunting, which is why I would highly advise becoming a confident rider on the Summerboard before throwing yourself into the deep end. But at the end of the day, riding next to traffic really just amounts to knowing how to ride on narrow paths while also being able to separate the motions of the upper half of your body with that of the lower half. Join those two basic skills together and you shouldn't feel too scared riding next to traffic. And this skill in particular is going to help a lot when it comes to doing tricks. But before that, let's talk about the elephant in the room, that is riding in switch. Now everyone knows that if you're not riding in your preferred stance, that is to either have your left or right foot forward, depending on which one is your dominant leg, then riding the Summerboard will feel like you're a total beginner again. Now something that I've learned from seriously drilling switch in the last year is that you learn twice as fast. fast. And so although it is very uncomfortable to start riding in switch, especially when you've spent so much time learning to pick up the board in regular, you will learn it much faster. And the reason for learning to ride in switch is because quite honestly, every trick of the Summerboard is made 1,000 times easier if you're comfortable in the opposite stance. Whether it's frontside 180s to cut your speed, 360s, or even overslides, knowing how to ride in switch will make all of these tricks feel so much more comfortable. And actually, as far as I'm aware, it's the best way to learn these tricks. It might seem counterintuitive, but if you want to learn 180s and 360s, I would actually advise learning to ride in switch first, because once you've done that, learning the 180s and 360s will be so much easier. To be honest, the main advice I can give for learning to ride in switch is to just ride in switch every time you go summerboarding, and to apply everything from these previous sections so that you can develop a good stance and feel comfortable riding the board with light pressure. Every trick that you might have learned in regular can then be brought over to switch, and I've found it incredibly rewarding to relearn all of these tricks again and to start landing them in switch. It is very satisfying. Which takes us to the most important part for learning to commute with the Summerboard SBX, and that is to learn to do all of the crazy tricks. Because let's be real, this is why you bought the Summerboard, to do stuff like this on your commute to work. Spin frontside, spin backside, spin in reverse, or glide at very high speeds with sensations of flying above the ground due to the crazy center wheels. Tricks like frontside 180s or reverse carves, which is just riding in switch while looking over your shoulder, can all be practiced in a car park before you take them to the streets. Reverse carves around corners are one of my favorites, or even a little combo of a frontside 180 into a reverse carve, and don't forget to multiply all these tricks by 2 because you then learn them in switch. It is what will make your daily commute into a bit of a video game. It is like taking all of the downhill freeboarding tricks and bringing them to the city. As someone who learnt to freeboard before picking up the Summerboard, it is absolutely amazing to bring a part of the mountain to something as mundane as a commute to work. There's a traffic jam, or on the Summerboard it's an opportunity to practice going past a very narrow spot in order to get to the front of the traffic lights. Now obviously I can't go into extensive detail on how to do all of these tricks, but if you're wondering which tricks you should learn and a good order to learn them in, I'd recommend learning frontside then backside drifts to stop, then learn the same in switch. Once you've done this, upgrade them to 180s, both frontside and backside. Repeat the same in switch again, and then once you've done all of these, the 360s will come for free, because all you have to do is link the two together. Once you've done this, you can try learning these overslides, which is effectively just a backside 180 where you fix your line of sight to a particular spot, and the end result is that you end up looking over your shoulder while rolling on your toe side edge. This stance is more straightforward to get into if you start with a backside drift because you'll already be on your toe side edge. However, there is a very nice, slightly more difficult alternative, which is where you do a frontside 180 which drifts on your heel side, and then try and get into this overslide stance. You can then complete the turn by looking over your shoulder or pulling your arm in the direction that you want to spin, and it looks absolutely sick, and it's one that I'm still working on. So I hope this video gives you some direction as to how you can start to commute with the Summerboard SBX. Definitely check out Summerboard if you're interested in riding a board like this, they are absolutely awesome. Otherwise, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a good one.